I think I came here about 2 years ago in a position which was described roughly as technology scouting in that moment. So if you look at the title, one of the things which actually brought me here is that Swisscom felt the need of being a bit more innovative in their existing business. And this is what I would say the last journey about the last 24 months has been about. I used to say about a year ago, I used to have the best job in the world, you know, hanging out in California, sunny California, being paid for going to conferences like that, understand what's happening, right? Get to listen to all these wise guys, what's happening in the market. And for somebody who has worked in the IT industry for about 20 years, it's like being a small boy in a toy store, because there's lots of things which can be discovered. Now, that has changed a bit since I would say the last 6 months. So my wife is now complaining and saying, like, you know, we got here to the US and actually I don't see you anymore. So what's happening? That doesn't really change my view on you know, how satisfied are you with your job. I just don't hang out and enjoy California anymore. I have a lot of work, and the reason is that I don't know why, but somebody listened actually to the things I was saying for a couple of times and said, like, okay, so we need to change. And Swisscom has kicked off a large, very massive initiative towards building what we call the Swisscom Cloud. And the aim is to actually put every single service we deliver on top of it. When I say every single service, Swisscom in our country, we are a holistic carrier. So we do everything from outsourcing, fixed net to mobile network. So we serve enterprise customers, we serve consumers, and even we operate a large network which is sold to others as well. So the idea of that massive approach is actually we want one homogeneous platform where we can put it all onto it. And this is what we're currently busy with. I'm saying that because when I listen to all the speakers before me, they used to use the past in their sentence when they're talking about what they have done. A lot of the things I will tell you about today is what we are about to do. Right? So we're still in an idea planning phase. We're already in an execution phase, but we're definitely not done yet. And I think that's kind of a disclaimer. So if you look at what is already operational, it might be slightly difficult to show you a lot. But on the other hand, I thought, like, this is a good chance to talk to people who actually think in the same direction and open a communication stream, because I definitely think that a service provider is not longer kind of a gateway for services into its market. As an incumbent, we have to realize that we are living in a service provider economy. We're just a part, just one member, and we need to find different ways of partnering if we want to become successful. I've chosen that strange name, like, you know, Cloud Foundry as an enabler for ICT services as a teaser. And the one or other working in IT for a long time might think, like, okay, yeah, this is the last thing we have actually waited for, a telco provider telling us what we have to do in IT. So I think one of the things I'd like to explain you is what we're about to do and why we're doing that, and also not underestimating the fact that as a telco service provider, we do have a major challenge, and this is not just remaining attractive for our consumer with the typical telco services, right? Because there are services like Skype out there which are much more attractive for certain users than the telephony services we actually offer. And on the other hand, if we really want to expand our scope, we need to do IT differently in order to be successful. But let me just start off with why is actually Swisscom as a telco operator doing that. I used to call that the Telco Dilemma. So what we see is there's a continuous growth in terms of demand, more bandwidth, more flexibility. The times or the periods where we can invest, and I mean heavily invest into building new infrastructure and capitalize on that investment, it gets shorter, shorter, and shorter, right? So there's the high demand on building out telco infrastructure. On the other hand, the single services we currently offer, they are obviously under margin pressure. That's not, you don't have to be a wizard to see that, right? So And that's, at the moment, it doesn't work out. And that's already seen for the last, I would say, 10, 15 years. But the way most telco service providers, and that's not typical to Swisscom, we're just one of the companies who actually does the same like all the other telco providers as well, is going through 3 different phases. And it depends on the country when it started, but actually you will see that phases nearly in every single market. So the first phase is about 10, 15 years ago, right, when telco service provider understood that there is something like an ICT, information and communication technology service. So we need to actually bring operations for IT services and telco services together, and then we can actually do that, everything, we can do that much more efficiently, and we keep our margin. So the trick most of the telco service providers did is, let's just buy a system integrator. And most of the time, a huge system integrator, right? What we realized after that is that IT outsourcing and mass production telco services is not the same. And ETOM and ITIL doesn't really translate to each other. So if you look at what happens to this first phase is, I mean, all of the incumbents, they still have their IT system integrator arm, but what you see is that the IT organization is an own business unit under the umbrella of an incorporated or whatever. So it always has been an independent business unit. And everything what happens after that is just an internal supplier-customer relationship, which even financial-wise didn't always work out for every single operator. So if you look at the system integrator, within the operator, they normally have about 50 or 60% market share in delivering services internally, where there's not a lot of market pressure. And you see that on the margins which are made. You see that actually on the way operators have to price their services. And some are really struggling to remain competitive, even if they don't have a lot of service provider competition in their country. So I wouldn't necessarily call that a success. It's just a given. That was there. So the second phase then, I call that we can do web services as well, right? So you have seen a lot of a lot of carriers actually try to become what we call an OTT, an over-the-top service. It's actually like a nice pronunciation. It's just showing that you become a service provider which runs completely on an IP stack, so you don't need a network to provide your services. We call that OTT, right? And then you have seen a lot of service providers, especially the bigger ones, right, who invested massive resources in to become an OTT service provider themselves, because then they thought, like, we can compete with the existing service providers, like a Google, like a Facebook. And so they created the same services. And if we see what happens to that initiative, I mean, there's just the fundamental problem with, does that really scale and does that really work, right? So if I compare somebody like a Skype, who had something like 500 million subscribers already 4 years ago, right? If you compare that base, it's even more than people who live in the United States. So how big of a carrier do you want to be to really create the same customer base like most of the OTT competitors? And then there's the fact about the consolidation of the distribution channels. So if you want to create these OTT services and bring that to the market, it's just a matter of fact that there are not too many distribution channels. Like, you know, there's Google Play for the Android, and there's iTunes for Apple, and there's not really need for a service provider store to become next software distribution channel. A couple of companies have tried that, a couple of service providers we have tried that, guilty as well. But that didn't work out as well, right? And now, in my understanding, what we're currently seeing is that's the next phase, the third phase of, you know, actually we are the cloud, right? So there's a need of local relevance. You have to build IT infrastructure in the country. And I see that when I talk about a lot of colleagues, right? So they have spent a lot of money into building their own version of a cloud management system. Most of them focus on OpenStack. In an earlier phase, we actually use something like an enterprise virtualization platform and put a self-service on top. But it's always the thought like, so we are actually providing that infrastructure services further on to our customer base. Now that brings me to a major question, which I would say, like, really? I mean, if you look at the infrastructure as a service market, about 3/4 of the market is done by, guess who? Amazon, right? And the next followers are companies like Rackspace. Even if you look at the list of the infrastructure service providers who are actually selling infrastructure as a service, and where are they on the list? For the first 10, I don't see a single carrier, even if we have that situation. Is that wrong? Is that a wrong approach then? But I think that's a fair question, and that's some of the things we have thought about when we crafted our own cloud strategy. When we crafted that strategy, we just thought, like, okay, so there must be a need for local infrastructure, right? If that's so why? How can you actually address that market need? The first thing we have to realize, and most of the carriers reluctant on doing that, and I must admit, even internally, we have a lot of discussions around that. A carrier used to be the one who maintains the end-user relationship. That's one of our major assets, right? But when it comes to infrastructure within the cloud, we just have to realize that this has become a channel business. So I don't know anybody who is actually buying infrastructure as a service as a consumer, if you leave file sharing on the side for a moment. I don't, right? And honestly, most of our enterprise customers don't do that as well. Right? They used to buy that to run their massive enterprise software. They used to do that to run their massive enterprise applications. But when there's a move of services replacing enterprise applications, there's no need of doing that any longer. And here are some good examples. So you have, do you remember somebody like Siebel? It's Oracle now, right? So it used to be the market leader for CRM software. Today it's Salesforce, right? So who buys computing power to enable their Salesforce instance? Nobody does that, right? So the infrastructure itself becomes a channel. Or, I mean, even if you can go to deeper infrastructure services. You know, like there used to be something like an ArcSight. Well, there's still something like an ArcSight where you run your application within your own data center, right? But today there's a service called Splunk, which for most of the companies does pretty much the same, right? And we can go on and on and on. So there's something like a SharePoint, and there's a Boxnet on the other side, right? There's something like an SAP, and there's something like it's a SuccessFactors or Workday on the other side. So whenever we talk about services and software as a service, right, which gains market share, that decreases the need of directly buying infrastructure services. So for somebody who actually lives on selling infrastructure services, that's bad news, right? So when we crafted our strategy, one of the things we are focusing on is we have to accept that the infrastructure business becomes a channel business. So we have to find channel partners and new ways of working together with them. The next thing is about hybrid delivery. And what I mean by that is, and this is now coming to how do we become competitive? When is there, or where is there actually a need for having infrastructure locally or in my own data center, right? So if I'm using a SaaS service, obviously there's not. But let's just focus a little bit on what happens to the SaaS market. So the first SaaS providers, the ones who actually empower most of the infrastructure offerings today, they are focusing on consumer services. Like, so it's a Facebook, it's a Google, it's a LinkedIn. They directly address the end user. Well, what happened about 18 months ago is, and you see that in the flow of the money, which is kind of the interesting thing, is like, you know, where do venture capitalists invest their money? They actually switched their focus from investing into consumer-oriented SaaS companies into investing into business-oriented customers. And now there's a little switch. So while in the US, I think that's still working. That model is still working, saying like, I just set up my service on bare metal, I run the data center, or I rent the data center capacity and bring out my SaaS service to the end customer. As soon as you actually want to expand in other markets, as a company who is based here, does their software development over here, you are actually faced with CIOs saying, okay, so I like your service. I like my users to use bring your own device concepts. I like my users actually to sign up for the service themselves instead of delivering that all from central IT. But I have to take control where my data is, right? And the whole discussion around PRISM and the NSA actually brought that just to the public. But this discussion is already going on for a long time. So as a service provider, if I want to reach out to other markets than my home market, I have to think about how do I actually bring my service onto a different stage. So there's one obvious solution. I built my data center in Europe as well, right? People are doing that, building data centers in Ireland or in the Netherlands, and they put another data center in Southeast Asia. So then this guy comes back and talks to the CIO in Switzerland, and he's saying, we are not EU. I need the data in my country, right? So you just expanded from having 3 theaters, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. You just expanded the focus from, I need to build 3 data centers to I need to build something like 350 data centers to serve all my customers. And there still might be companies who are able to do that, right? But how many? How many service providers have enough capability to build a data center in every single country where they want to deliver the services to a business customer? So we think that this is one of the cornerstones. If we build a cloud as Swisscom, one of the cornerstones is we need to enable hybrid delivery. You can use the service based on a shared infrastructure wherever you're going to need that, right? So there's no way that Swisscom will compete on a scale with somebody like an Amazon, right? But there's a need for shared infrastructure in the country as well. But you won't be able to address that market if you're not cooperating, if you don't leave the choice. Dev test runs on Amazon, production runs in Switzerland. If you're not able to enable that, then you're running into trouble. And we can even expand that, because then you have some services running by banks, and they're not even good with running it in a shared data center within Switzerland. They want to run that in their own secured data center, right? So enable hybrid services on the infrastructure level, leaving the choice to the end customer whether he wants to run that as cheap as possible, controlled somewhere in a regional border, or 100% controlled by himself. This is what I mean by hybrid delivery, and that's one of the cornerstones of our strategy. The third point is about open source, and that's one of the reasons which brings me here. So Cloud Foundry definitely was not the first one who actually communicated the idea of platform as a service to the market. There were others as well. And there are a lot of competitors, as well as service providers, Google Apps Engine, right? There are also other companies who actually bring that software to the market, let's say Heroku or .cloud. There are enough companies out there. But the point is, if you want to enable an ecosystem, and for us as a service provider, it's less about software development, it's more about software delivery, right? Then you need to make sure that there's a broad group of people who have actually access to the core technology. So selecting open source initiatives instead of relying on infrastructure vendors who build infrastructure towards a protocol standard, that's a major shift, right? In the past, operators loved standards, protocol standards, right? Because then there had been enough. There had been a market where enough suppliers could actually build their own infrastructure against. We have to realize that this is not going fast enough any longer. So the new standard is not, for me, it's not a protocol standard any longer. It's more or less is selecting the right pieces of open source software you actually build your strategy around. The fourth point is openness for partnerships. As I said, we are a service provider. We are not a software developer, right? So I don't see ourselves in developing a file sharing application in competition to Boxnet or Dropbox. That's not going to happen. We can do that. Well, if somebody else from Swisscom would stay here, we would do it, right? But on the long run, that doesn't fly. Definitely not, because there are so many companies out there who actually build applications towards a new ecosystem that as a service provider, you never can keep up, right? So there's no way that you can do that. So we need to build an infrastructure which is open enough for partnerships on nearly all levels. We need to be open for partnerships on the infrastructure level, right? So partner with companies like an Amazon, like in Rackspace. We need to be open on the service platform itself, right? To partner with companies who actually do the service. And and not run the infrastructure. And we also need to be open for partnership when it comes to development of front-end services. And the last point, and that's maybe one which is, for some people might be quite obvious, it's a focus on the end user. So coming from a service provider who has seen two different sides, and that's the consumer business and the enterprise business, there's a reason why IT outsourcing and consumer-based telco services doesn't go together. And very often that's crafted around the terminology around multi-tenancy. What it actually means is that when it comes to IT outsourcing, the IT department of your enterprise customers becomes its own service provider, and they build a huge infrastructure around, right? So if you want to incorporate an offering in there, you need to deal with that, right? Whether it be identity federation, whether you expose SOAP APIs on the enterprise service bus. There are a lot of flavors of doing that. While on the consumer side, the touch point to the end user, it used in the past, it used to be just the plug in the wall, right? So there is something which lies completely underneath. It needs to be able to scale to all different users. So when we at Swisscom crafted our strategy, one of the things we wanted to deliver to the market is a combination which we call B2B2C services, right? Which means like taking advantage of your market position, and Swisscom owns it in both areas, IT outsourcing and consumer-based services between 60 and 70% of the market, right? So one of the things we have built our strategy around is, when we crafted services we want to build on our own, is that we need to combine these two worlds, right? So let me just make one example. We deployed about 1.2 to 1.5 million set-top boxes for IPTV, right? And on the other hand, we actually serve enterprise customers with telepresence systems so that they can start doing telepresence between each other. One of the services we have in mind when I say like there's a need for B2B2C services is, why can't that IP television set-top box not be an endpoint for a telepresence system, right? So that's one of the things we're actually talking about. If you talk about a file sharing application, right? Today, you actually use the file sharing application for one reason. You can actually file share between different operating systems, right? You can run it on your Mac, you can run it on your PC, you can run it on your iOS device and on your Android device, and you always go back to the same file, right? So how can a service provider add value to that? Well, obviously, rebuilding functionality is not the way to go. But what we can do is, with a service provider having a stake in the enterprise market, and on the other hand, having a regional focus, we can actually add content to that file sharing capability. So imagine a file sharing application which not just lets you save data from your PC and call that from the mobile phone, but automatically filling in your local mail into a folder, right? And if we build it secure enough, that could also be your house or your bank account, right? Coming directly to the inbox of your file sharing application and not via snail mail into your postbox, right? There might be another service we are thinking about, and this is, there actually we have released something which is built around unified communication, right? So I know a lot of people who actually still operate two different phones, right? And for somebody who travels international, that's quite usual that you use an IP connection like a Skype or whatever, right? Like a SIP service. Whenever you have an IP connection, right? And when you travel back into the country, you actually use your normal phone to talk to somebody. Now, one of the things is, if you really sell as many phones to the end user, why do you actually have to go back and talk to your enterprise customers, sell them a PBX and another desk phone or a UC client, which is actually exactly the same? Again, there's actually no need for that, right? So, but this is how the business runs today. So we have about 1.2 million business users who actually get a PBX together with a PBX client or with a desk phone, while they already have bought a mobile phone. Is that really necessary? I don't think so, right? So if we craft the service good enough, right, then we will be able to connect that client to every infrastructure. And it doesn't have to be the service provider infrastructure. It could be the enterprise infrastructure as well. How are you going to do that? The first thing what we have to realize is that there are different ways of delivering applications today. And I just crafted that in these, I just described that in these 3 different entities, right? So there's a traditional way, which I call enterprise virtualization. There's one which is a service operation used by most of the service providers, and there's another one which I would call platform as a service. Where these models really are different is the way you deliver application to the end user. While in enterprise virtualization, we all know that, you actually build an application based on a database, put the business logic into the application server, and then build a client, and that has to run on a high available operating system called a virtual server. Right? So this is what we call enterprise virtualization. If we move to the service itself, something we call elastic services, the operating system itself actually moves up to the application layer. You build something around, call that an appliance, and now you use the intelligence and the availability of the internet, of the network, to actually spread out and scale out as soon as load comes up to the system. Disadvantage with that is you can't just move an application from A to B, right? Because there's a different way of how to handle data. And you have to know which kind of APIs you write your application to. You need to know how do you handle your data within your application. So we haven't seen a lot of companies who have been successful move from enterprise virtualization to service operation. And the need is you have to go very, very deep into the source code to write it differently. So the service space is kind of a greenfield approach, right? So we build new services and we compete with the existing enterprise world. And now the third, and this is I guess what we actually talk about here, is that there is a new approach towards that, because the disadvantage of rewriting the code all the time, well, people start to recognize that, right? So they're looking for a different way of doing that. And this is where the application container actually caught our interest. Why is that so important? If I just show you high level what we're doing within Swisscom, one of the aims, and this is what I colored light blue, is to what extent can you actually standardize your operations? To what extent is it mass production, what you're delivering? And where do you have to start develop individual services for your customer? And there's a huge difference if I distinguish between these 3 different areas. By the way, internally we call them enterprise cloud, service cloud, and application cloud. This is not common terminology. We just use that to distinguish between that. But the point, and this is quite important, is that for a service operator who is used to run mass services and has a huge fabric which produce these virtual services, it is important to what extent can I actually standardize my service and deliver my service before somebody gets in and said, like, I take that service and I build an individual solution for the end customer, right? And this is why we distinguish between these 3 different delivery streams. I wouldn't underestimate the fact that just describing 3 different cloud initiatives is not enough, right? So I highlighted in dark blue 3 out of 5 components where we actually leave the area of we just buy some infrastructure and build it into our network and then deliver that as a service. This is where we started, and this is what kept me busy the last 6 months. This is where we started to become a software developer on our own. So we identified the need of building abstraction layers into that architecture so that we are able to become independent from the virtualization environment, to become independent from the application itself, but still deliver a service to our end customer, right? So when I talk about access management, what that actually is access brokerage, right? We try to get away from identifying a user against, can I say that, Active Directory or whatever, right? So we want to leverage, we want to leverage the existence of having an identity store which identifies every single user in Switzerland physically before he can actually enter that service. And there's a difference. If you go to a Facebook, you get that Facebook identification as well, and you can use that all over the cloud. But there's a difference whether you need an email address or you need a passport to get access to that world. So everything the access management is about is to leverage that access and then expand the service to something which is transactional, committed, and reliable. Because if you want to buy some stuff, or if you want to deal for your own organization and have legal commitment behind, you have to be identified differently than just setting up an email account and being identified against that email account. Service management, that's kind of tricky. This is the idea here is that we take every kind of resources we have in our cloud, and this is either an infrastructure resource or an application resource, and expose that as service. It's kind of tricky because if you go to enterprise virtualization, there's an administrative process where you actually call infrastructure resources, right? If you move into the service cloud where the application itself uses an API to call infrastructure resources, where does the CIO or the service provider administrator get the chance in putting in some rules, right? So for dev test, go to that cloud. For production, go to that cloud. Only use services unless you have enough money left, and all that. So where do you ingest these business rules? In one common point. So that, defining that common point in our infrastructure, this is what the service management is about. And the last one is about domain management. That's maybe a bit far out, and that might be, needs most explanation. But as I said, like we want to overcome something like multi-tenancy, right? But you still have different domains. And there are domains like a private domain, which is usually a tenant, right? There are public domain, like a service we're going to use, like the UC service I've talked about, right? Well, you need to distinguish between these services and secure these services. We are going away from building IP zones in our network any longer. This is what we have done in the past. But the problem with building IP domain zones is you have to control the gateways, and this is normally done manually. So there's no way that an application itself, written by somebody you don't control, and as a service provider we have to deal with these applications, right, can go out to your router and change the settings, right? So what we're doing, when I say domain management, what we're doing there is we try to adopt something like software-defined networking and use tunnels instead of IP zones in order to create security domains. And on the infrastructure tier, it should be flexible enough, as I said, to either go into a partner data center, a Swisscom data center, or a privately owned data center. In order to deliver that, we have selected a couple of standards, make that happen, and as you might wonder, this is not very much, but this is actually where we built our architecture around. So the first selection we had done is, what kind of infrastructure layer do we use? And the common denominator across the different infrastructure components for us is the x86 processor. Not more, not less, right? So there's nobody where we craft our services against to an infrastructure vendor, apart from it has to be that. This was necessary in order to secure the whole cloud, because you need a lever somewhere to make sure that the compute resources you're actually going to provide are trusted compute resources. There could have been other choices. We have focused on x86 technology. The next thing is Linux. As I said, most of the services we're going to release right now are built towards an elastic infrastructure. Elastic infrastructure means you actually couple the operating system with the application into an appliance, right? So there's no way that the operating system kernel can be kind of a licensed software. You have to be open, you have to be free in order to do that, and this is why we focus on Linux for that. Infrastructure APIs, right? So there are just two infrastructure APIs which actually have a significant market share. There's OpenStack and there's Amazon Web Services. I think that's an obvious choice, right? If you want to go out and deliver APIs privately in your own infrastructure as a service provider, but also partner with other service providers, OpenStack is kind of the only choice. What is left? Well, and Cloud Foundry, one of the reasons is why we focus on Cloud Foundry is so hard is not just the technology, but it's also just the fact that we can run the platform as a service offering on top of a virtualized stack, while most of the successful other PaaS providers go down to manage the infrastructure themselves, and this, for us, was not an option. So is it just an idea, or how far are you? Well, We actually went far beyond just having some nice ideas and putting out some interesting slides. One of the things which is obviously, I guess it's not known here in the room, is we launched a new communication service, which is IO. IO competes directly with a telecom service, right? So it's an over-the-top XMPP-based communication service. What's interesting with IO, though, is that even if you call a telephone number, the specific telephone number in Switzerland, the call is routed to the XMPP service. So if you leave the country, you're working completely on an IP layer. You're not bound back to roaming services. If you're in the country, you have the reliable PSTN service underneath. And as a user, you don't have to worry about it, right? It's automatically done. So you get your telephone number, but you get a client which is available through a SIP URL as well, so that you can avoid roaming charges whenever you leave the country. Next thing what we did is we built a real-time billing interface for non-telco services, right? So billing within a telco is kind of, I would say, the holy cow. Don't touch it. So one of the first things we did is we built an interface that we are able to ingest billing signals. We call them, funny enough, CDRs as well, but not for call detailed record, but for cloud data records, that we are able to ingest these billing signals into our fulfillment and assurance business system so that we can bill every single user for a service he's going to use. Next thing we did is we implemented an API management platform that was an upper layer of the access broker. So we expose our identity store and some of the other APIs, basic APIs, already as a REST API within the infrastructure, and it can be used by every single service which runs underneath. And then the last thing we did is we actually started the development of what we call our Cloud OS. We thought that this would be a clever name when we came up with it, and between I have heard it so many times, and there are many different people using it in a different environment. So the Swisscom Cloud OS is definitely not another OpenStack distribution. Let me be clear on that, right? So it's the combination of the 5 components. 3 I've already shown, which is our access broker. It's the service manager or resource manager, and it's the domain management or the SDN controller we built it on. And beside that, there are 2 more components. One is the security management solution, and one is what we call the business management solution. Yeah? Taking the real-time signal and then building the products not sitting on a service catalog, but sitting on a, I would say, on an analytics stream, so that you are able to change the products without touching every single asset within your CMDB any longer, right? And the last thing we did, and I think that's the most important thing, is we actually build out our presence here in the Silicon Valley into a collaboration hub with the objective for delivering continuous innovation. And we built it here because we want to work with everybody who is actually following the same path and likes to enter Switzerland with its services.